How did a state transform murder into a colossal and flawlessly functioning bureaucratic machine? In the shadows of the Second World War, right behind the regular armies crossing borders, a dark force unrecorded by history until that day emerged onto the stage. The lists of names typewritten in Reinhard Heydrich's headquarters manifested into an absolute and ruthless reality of death behind the front lines. This documentary traced the bloody footsteps of the mobile death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen across a vast geography stretching from the desolate forests of Poland to the sandy Babi Yar ravine of Kiev and into the freezing cold of Riga. The psychological collapse experienced by the execution squads as they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, and how this evolved murder into a quieter, more mechanical and fabricated system was documented in all its stark reality. These operations, which began under the guise of military security, transformed first into a project of total annihilation, and subsequently into a dark cover-up effort where evidence was destroyed in massive fires by the Action 1005 units. At the end of this heavy journey, the confessions echoing through the cold courtrooms of Nuremberg proved how an entire state mechanism had transformed into a fully institutionalized industry of murder. While leafing through these dark pages of history in the heavy silence of the night, if this profound narrative is appreciated, a gentle invitation is extended to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Furthermore, sharing thoughts and recommendations regarding this era in the comments is kindly requested. Bureaucracy and violence merged into a single iron fist in the late 1930s, and the first footsteps of those death squads, advancing eastward in the shadow of the Wehrmacht, slowly echoed through the pages of history. By the mid-1930s, Germany's internal security and intelligence apparatus entered a process of radical transformation. The Schutzstaffel, SS, under the command of Heinrich Himmler, gradually absorbed the entirety of the state's police force into its own ranks. However, the figure who shaped the true striking force of this colossal structure was Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich designed a mechanism that would eliminate not only inter-party opposition, but also all potential enemies in the territories yet to be conquered. The security service, led by Heydrich, moved beyond mere intelligence gathering and took steps to transform into an operational execution force. In 1936, the secret state police, the Gestapo, and the criminal police, the Kripo, merged under the umbrella of the Sicherheitspolizei. Heydrich forged the state's official police force and the SS's intelligence unit, the SD, into a single iron fist. This move formed the institutional foundation of the death squads that would later drench Europe in blood. The regular army crossing borders and destroying enemy forces did not meet the SS leadership's definition of a complete victory. According to Heydrich's plans, special mobile units were needed right behind the army's frontline advance to cleanse civilian areas. The mission of these units was not to clash with enemy soldiers, but to identify and eradicate ideological opponents, intellectuals, and undesirable elements in the captured territories. The pretext of securing the rear lines in newly conquered lands was engineered as a tool to legitimize an unprecedented state terror. Reinhard Heydrich named these mobile units the Einsatzgruppen, meaning task forces. Bureaucracy and violence intertwined flawlessly. Hundreds of officers, intelligence agents, and policemen were armed with absolute ideological loyalty beneath their uniforms. Blacklists prepared in the central offices in Berlin were thrust into the hands of these units. Thus, as the Wehrmacht advanced on the front, the Einsatzgruppen marched in its shadow and took on the task of systematically eliminating the state's designated targets. Names typed out in headquarters turned into a ruthless reality in the field. This systematic structure went down in records as the first concrete step of history's darkest execution mechanism. In March 1938, German armies crossed the Austrian border. It was not only military troops that crossed the border. Vanguard SS units, hidden in the shadow of the regular army and bearing the name Einsatzkommando Österreich, advanced into Austrian territory simultaneously with the Wehrmacht. There were no enemy soldiers in the crosshairs of these special teams. Their mission was to swiftly paralyze the administrative and intelligence nerve centers of the annexed nation. When the units reached Vienna, they headed directly for government buildings, police headquarters, and intelligence offices. Critical documents and state archives were seized before they could be destroyed. These documents created an unparalleled source of information for the SS headquarters in Berlin. Simultaneously, pre-prepared blacklists were put into action. Political dissidents, supporters of the former regime, communists, and Jewish leaders were rounded up from their homes and offices within hours. Tens of thousands of people were arrested in the first few days and sent to newly established concentration camps. This operation in Austria went down in history as the first major field test where the army and intelligence operated in unison. The success of this initial test gave Reinhard Heydrich and his staff immense confidence. Months later, following the resolution of the Sudetenland crisis in October 1938, the German army entered the region, trailed this time by better equipped and more organized Einsatzgruppen units. The objective remained the same: to eliminate potential threats swiftly and silently before a military conflict could begin. When the rest of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and Moravia was occupied in March 1939, the system functioned with mechanical perfection. As German tanks rolled through the streets of Prague, SS and Gestapo officers entered buildings holding special search books called the Sonderfahndungsliste. The names, addresses, and political connections of the individuals to be arrested were coded down to the finest detail within these ledgers. The Czech intelligence network, union leaders, and academics were unmasked within hours and severed from the system. During the Austrian and Czechoslovakian operations, mass execution squads did not yet fully enter the picture. The mission remained largely confined to arrests, exile, and intelligence gathering. However, these seemingly bloodless administrative takeovers laid the groundwork for a much darker future. The SS units proved their ability to operate independently behind the army lines. The officers learned to manage logistical crises in the field, integrate local police forces into their own ranks, and cast a psychological web of terror over the civilian population. All these bureaucratic experiences served as a successful laboratory experiment for the colossal massacres to be implemented in the impending World War. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, as German panzers crossed the Polish border, a mechanism that would alter the course of military history also sprang into action. Right behind the advancing units of the Wehrmacht, 6 Einsatzgruppen units, under the command of Reinhard Heydrich, entered Polish territory. This was the first major military campaign where the task forces were deployed to the field at full capacity and with a lethal mandate. Unlike the bloodless purges in Austria and Czechoslovakia, the strategy to be applied in Poland was built directly upon annihilation. The operation was codenamed Tannenberg. The objective of this plan, prepared months in advance, was to eradicate the Polish state's masterminds, cultural elites, and all individuals possessing leadership capacity in a single stroke. The blacklist titled Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, Special Prosecution Book Poland, meticulously prepared by SS intelligence and the Gestapo before the invasion, was handed over to the mobile death squads waiting at the border. This thick ledger contained more than 61,000 names. Politicians, academics, doctors, lawyers, teachers, clergymen, journalists, and even former Olympic athletes were marked as potential focal points of resistance. Following the crossing of the border, Einsatzgruppen units rapidly spread into Polish cities and towns, and administrative cold-bloodedness prevailed during the operations executed based on the name lists. The targeted individuals were taken from their homes or workplaces in the middle of the night, bypassing legal interrogations or judicial processes entirely. Removed from the city centers, these civilians were taken to predetermined forested areas or quiet valleys. History bore witness to the consecutive echoes of gunshots ringing out in these desolate regions. The intellectual stratum of Polish society was systematically executed by firing squad at the edge of freshly dug mass graves. Operation Tannenberg fundamentally altered the nature of the Einsatzgruppen. These units ceased to be an intelligence and police force, transforming into mobile execution squads. Throughout September and October, tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered simply because of their education, status, or profession. A specific and devastating strike was directed against the Catholic Church. Hundreds of priests were dragged from their monasteries and executed. The ultimate goal was to leave behind nothing but a leaderless, uneducated, and easily manipulated mass that could be utilized solely as slave labor. These events in Poland were not merely a war crime, but also a ruthless field rehearsal for an ideological state policy. The executions were bound to a mechanical routine. The members of the squads took refuge behind a strict chain of command to alleviate the psychological weight of opening fire on ordinary civilians. Reports were forwarded to Berlin regularly, and the death tolls were recorded into tables as cold statistics. The blood spilled on Polish soil became the first definitive harbinger of a much grander and devastating darkness that would shroud Eastern Europe in the coming years. The invasion of Poland was not just a military victory, but also a bloody breaking point for the balance of power within the German state apparatus. Wehrmacht officers, raised with traditional Prussian military discipline, confronted the actions of the SS units, advancing behind them while fighting on the front. The open executions of the civilian population, intellectuals, and Jews by the Einsatzgruppen caused deep unrest within the army. Regular army personnel, trained according to military rules and the laws of prisoners of war, witnessed civilians being gunned down in the middle of the street and mass slaughters. This situation triggered a silent yet fierce tension between two different power centers behind the front lines. The most prominent and vocal representative of this tension was the commander of the Eighth Army, General Johannes Blaskowitz. Blaskowitz, who demonstrated outstanding military achievements during the Polish campaign, was appointed as the military commander of the region immediately after the battle. As soon as he assumed his post, He received countless complaints and reports from his subordinate officers regarding the unchecked violence of the SS and police units. Blaskowitz quickly realized that the events taking place were not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic policy of extermination and terror. He feared that the discipline of his own troops would collapse, and that his soldiers would become corrupted by being made complicit in this brutality. General Blaskowitz took a historic step and documented the unfolding savagery in official records. In November 1939 and February 1940, he prepared comprehensive memorandums of protest that detailed the actions of the SS down to the finest detail. In these reports, he explicitly stated that the Einsatzgruppen had slaughtered tens of thousands of innocent people, that incidents of looting and rape had become widespread, and that the honor of the army had suffered an irreparable blow. Blaskowitz drew attention to the psychological ruin this violence inflicted upon the army personnel, and emphasized that these actions would drive the Polish people into a fanatic resistance. These heavy indictments were forwarded directly to the commander-in-chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch. However, Blaskowitz's pursuit of justice and military honor crashed against the cold, ideological walls of Berlin. When the reports reached Adolf Hitler's desk, the outcome was an absolute surrender for the Wehrmacht. Hitler dismissed Blaskowitz's concerns as childish and weak posturing. He granted full and definitive support to the independent operations of the SS and police forces under civilian administration. The Army High Command backed down in the face of this harsh reaction from Hitler. Brauchitsch and the Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, did not stand behind Blaskowitz and quietly closed the matter. The suppression of this objection set a terrifying precedent for the remainder of the Second World War. General Johannes Blaskowitz was dismissed from his post shortly thereafter and removed from the chain of command in the East. The regular army completely lost the authority and the will to intervene in the murders committed by the SS. The Wehrmacht agreed to turn a blind eye to the crimes committed in its rear, and thus the Einsatzgruppen gained a total independence where it could operate without facing any institutional hurdles. The silencing of these objections flashed a bloody green light for the even greater massacres that loomed ahead. Following the bloody purge operations in Poland, the nature and objectives of the Einsatzgruppen radically shifted in an irreversible manner. Execution orders that initially targeted only the state's masterminds, elites, and political leaders reached an unprecedented scale with the interventions of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. The target board was expanded. It was no longer just potential resistors, but also the masses defined as undesirable by the ideology that became a part of the program of total annihilation. In late September 1939, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, Reichssecurity Main Office, which gathered all the security units of the state under a single roof, was established, and the management of the death squads was coordinated entirely from this new center. In October 1939, Himmler launched a large-scale demographic engineering project for the rapid Germanization of the occupied Eastern territories. New orders issued to the SS and police units dictated that hundreds of thousands of Poles and Jews be torn from their homes and exiled to the east, to the region designated as the General Government, General Gouvernement. The Einsatzgruppen ceased to be a mere execution squad and became the main actor in a colossal mechanism of migration and exile that forcibly altered the demographic structure of an entire geography. Cities and villages were encircled, people were crammed into freight trains in the freezing cold, and abandoned to the unknown. During these deportations, tens of thousands of civilians perished on the roads due to starvation, cold, and disease. In this era, physical extermination and forced migration policies became deeply intertwined. The decision to confine Jews to isolated zones in major cities, namely the ghettos, was also made during this phase of radicalization. People were locked away behind high walls and barbed wire. Starvation and epidemics were utilized as an unofficial method of extermination. Simultaneously, thousands of disabled and sick individuals residing in mental asylums and care homes across Polish territory were systematically slaughtered by SS troops. These massacres formed the field practice for the secret euthanasia program that would later be implemented within Germany, and the initial trials of toxic gas usage were carried out during this process. Every new circular issued from Heydrich's office escalated the dose of violence and completely eradicated all moral boundaries. Executions no longer required a specific crime or a potential threat. The ethnic origin of the victims was deemed a sufficient justification on its own to seal their fate. SS officers pushed the boundaries of shaping demographic engineering through bloodshed and perfected the methods they applied. The final months of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland served as a dark rehearsal for a far greater apocalypse that would be experienced with the future invasion of the Soviet Union. Violence became mechanized. The line between bureaucracy and massacre was completely erased. Because the feeble objections of the regular army were suppressed, SS units comfortably applied their lethal doctrines in the field without encountering any legal or military obstacles. This period, in which borders in the east of Europe were redrawn with blood and exile, permanently constructed the infrastructure of a radical war of annihilation. In the spring months of 1941, the German war machine completed its final preparations for a colossal offensive towards the east. This plan, named Operation Barbarossa, was designed not merely as a military occupation where borders would be redrawn, but simultaneously as a war of ideological and racial annihilation. To organize the field executioners of this ideological war, a silent and lethal gathering took place in the small Saxon town of Pretzsch in May 1941. SS, SD, Gestapo personnel, and regular police units summoned from all corners of Germany were brought together with border guards at the police academy in this town. By the order of Reinhard Heydrich, the foundations of the massive death squads that would operate across the vast geography of the Soviet Union were laid here. The Einsatzgruppen were divided into 4 massive main groups, taking into consideration the geographical vastness and the density of the targeted population. The units were designated as Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D. Not ordinary militiamen or fanatic soldiers, but highly educated bureaucrats, lawyers, economists, and academics were appointed to the command echelons of these mobile groups, which consisted of approximately 3,000 men in total. This strategic choice ensured that the slaughter was carried out not like a savage rebellion, but as a cold-blooded duty of the state. Franz Walter Stahlecker took command of Group A, Arthur Nebe of Group B, Otto Rasch of Group C, and Otto Ohlendorf of Group D. The distribution map of the groups was drawn with near surgical precision according to the axis of the regular army's advance. Each Einsatzgruppen was attached to the major army groups of the Wehrmacht. Einsatzgruppen A, under the command of Franz Walter Stahlecker, was positioned behind Army Group North and was tasked with advancing through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. Einsatzgruppen B, led by Arthur Nebe, was directed into Belarusian territory and directly onto the Moscow line in the shadow of Army Group Center. Einsatzgruppen C, led by Otto Rasch, entered the vast agricultural lands of northern and central Ukraine alongside Army Group South. Einsatzgruppen D, commanded by Otto Ohlendorf, was positioned further south and mobilized behind the 11th Army towards southern Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus. An institutional consensus between the regular army and the SS was required for this unprecedented structure to operate flawlessly in the field. A definitive agreement was reached as a result of negotiations conducted between the Army Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner and Reinhard Heydrich. With this agreement, the Wehrmacht pledged to provide critical logistical support, such as gasoline, rations, accommodation, and radio communications, to these units that would slaughter civilians in their wake. In return, the Einsatzgruppen promised to alleviate the army's burden by ensuring security behind the front lines. With the mutual signatures, the dividing line between military warfare and ideological massacre completely vanished. As the final days of June arrived, the maps were drawn, the targets were set, and this dark army of 3,000 men silently deployed toward the staging areas on the Soviet border. At the dawn of June 22, 1941, the largest land offensive in history began. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet Union border across a broad front line with thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. Right behind this colossal military flood, the Einsatzgruppen units, having completed their preparations in the staging camps, advanced. However, crossing the border meant more than just seizing the territory of a nation. In the hands of these units lay a dark order that completely eradicated the traditional rules of war. Shortly before the operation, on June 6, 1941, an official and secret directive named the Commissar Order was issued by the High Command of the German Armed Forces. This lethal order gave a clear instruction to the Wehrmacht soldiers and the trailing SS units, political commissars within the Red Army, Communist Party officials, bureaucrats serving in the state's ideological apparatus, and civilian intellectuals were to be executed immediately upon capture. According to the decree, these individuals were not recognized as prisoners of war under the protection of international law. In the eyes of the National Socialist regime, they were defined as ideological threats that formed the masterminds of the state structure and required urgent eradication. The armed forces and the Einsatzgruppen operated in total cooperation toward this ruthless objective. While the regular army troops rapidly captured border villages and cities, the Einsatzgruppen vehicles, rolling along the dusty roads, right behind the front line, entered the towns. Political commissars were swiftly identified during the initial screenings among the hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht. The commissars, exposed either by the Red Star insignia they bore on their uniform sleeves or through the interrogation of other prisoners, were not sent to prisoner of war camps. Instead, they were handed over directly to the trailing Einsatzgruppen squads, or were shot by members of the regular army right at the edge of the trenches where they were captured. In the scorching heat of the summer months, the gunshots echoing across the Ukrainian plains, Belarusian forests, and Baltic shores proved how this strict directive was executed to the letter in the field. No military tribunals were established for the executions, no defense was taken from the prisoners, and no legal process was carried out. Captured political officials and regional intellectuals were executed by firing squad within minutes solely due to their identities and the titles they held. The initial situation reports sent to headquarters showed that thousands of commissars and civil servants were executed just a few days after the border was crossed. The Commissar order was not merely a legal cover for the massacres of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. It was also the greatest turning point where the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was directly and officially made complicit in the committed war crimes. The army handed over the prisoners it captured to the death squads without hesitation. The blood spilled in town squares and along forest edges during those first summer days, when the border was crossed, served as the first mechanical step of a total annihilation process that would sweep across vast Soviet lands and know no boundaries. As German troops crossed the Soviet border and advanced into the Baltic states and deep into Ukraine, the Einsatzgruppen commanders deployed a new and dark tactic. In accordance with the secret instructions sent by Reinhard Heydrich from Berlin, the anti-Soviet and anti-Jewish fury among the local population was deliberately fueled. The objective was to turn the local militias and civilians into executioners without requiring German soldiers to take direct action. In this way, the massacres that would unfold in the streets would appear from the outside as a spontaneously developing, justifiable act of revenge by the regional populace. In the Lithuanian city of Kaunas, this strategy succeeded with terrifying speed. When Einsatzgruppen A, under the command of Franz Walter Stahlecker, entered the city, local nationalists had already armed themselves and poured into the streets. Armed Lithuanian groups, guided from the background by German intelligence officers, launched sudden raids on the Jewish neighborhoods in the city. In the event that went down in history as the Liatuki's Garage massacre, dozens of civilian men gathered in the square were brutally beaten to death by local militias using iron bars and wooden clubs. German soldiers and SS officers gathered in the vicinity did not even attempt to stop this horror. Instead, they stood on the sidelines and watched the unfolding events in cold blood, simply taking photographs. This incident served as the first concrete proof of how the Einsatzgruppen could transform local collaborators into flawless death machines. A similar tableau of terror was experienced in the south, across the lands of Ukraine. When Einsatzgruppen C, commanded by Otto Rasch, reached the city of Lviv, they found a powerful pretext to instigate the local populace. The retreating Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had executed thousands of political prisoners by firing squad in their cells within the Lviv prisons. When the German troops entered the city, they brought these decaying corpses out of the dungeons and exhibited them to the public. SS propaganda officers placed the blame for this Soviet massacre directly on the city's Jewish population. The ensuing flood of fury, under the direction of German officers, morphed into a massive and uncontrolled pogrom, Ukrainian nationalists and ordinary civilians dragged the neighbors they had lived alongside for years from their homes and lynched them in the middle of the street. Thousands of innocent people were brutally murdered in this planned wave of violence that lasted for days. With these initial pogroms they orchestrated, the Einsatzgruppen conserved ammunition while simultaneously easing the psychological burden placed on their own personnel by the executions. The local militias operated as unofficial death squads in the shadow of the German army. These groups that stood out in the massacres were later officially armed and uniformed under the name Schutzmannschaft, auxiliary police. These collaborators became the greatest supporters of the SS across the Baltics and Ukraine for the remainder of the war. This instigated chaos spilling into the streets, demonstrated how easily the civilian population could be made complicit in violence, and it laid a ruthless groundwork for the impending decisions of total annihilation. By the midsummer of 1941, the operations of the Einsatzgruppen behind the front lines transitioned into an irreversible and much darker phase. During the initial weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the main targets of the death squads primarily consisted of Soviet political commissars, state officials, and adult men with the potential for conscription. However, this relatively limited wave of executions radically changed with the inspection visits made by SS leader Heinrich Himmler to the Eastern Front in August 1941. Himmler personally visited Minsk and other occupied cities, closely observing the operations of the firing squads behind the front. It was even noted in history that he grew faint during a mass execution he personally witnessed, when a victim's brain splattered. Following these visits and the meetings held with officers in the field, the scale of the orders coming from Berlin reached an unprecedented level of savagery. The ideological war completely transcended breaking a potential resistance or an administrative mechanism. With Himmler's verbal and written directives, the annihilation authority granted to the commanders in the field was raised to the absolute maximum. The scope of the individuals to be executed definitively included women, the elderly, and children. According to the perverse SS logic behind this decision, killing only adult men and leaving their families alive meant turning a blind eye to the upbringing of new generations that would seek revenge against the German Empire in the future. Women and children were classified as an avenging threat that would grow in the future. The victims no longer needed to possess a political affiliation, the capacity to carry weapons, or a potential for resistance. Their ethnic identity alone was deemed a sufficient and singular justification for them to be executed by firing squad. When this decision of total annihilation reached the troops in the field, the nature of the murders completely changed. Entire families were forced out of their homes, their belongings were confiscated, and they were marched towards silent forested areas. Crying infants, children clinging to their mothers, and the elderly struggling to stand, were lined up side by side at the edge of massive trenches. The mass shooting of women and children and tossing them into pits became a daily routine of the operation. This immense expansion of the target demographic strained the logistical capacity of the Einsatzgruppen and pushed the scale of the massacre to unimaginable dimensions. This new order also created an unexpected psychological pressure on the execution squads pulling the trigger. Shooting unarmed women and young children point blank, face to face, began to strain the strict discipline of even the most fanatic SS officers and police officers. Cases of alcoholism and nervous breakdowns rapidly increased within the squads. To prevent the psychological collapse of his soldiers, Himmler ordered the mechanization of the execution methods and the reduction of personal contact between the killers and the victims. In the ensuing months, this order led to the search for much more industrial methods of death. August 1941 became the most terrifying turning point in the history of the Einsatzgruppen and the Second World War. The murders completely shed the mask of military necessity or rear-line security and transformed into a pure genocide. The operations in the East ceased to be about defeating the enemy and became a massive, bloodthirsty industrial wheel turning to eradicate an entire people from their roots. In late September 1941, as the German army entered the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, pre-planted Soviet bombs exploded in succession in the city center. German military headquarters and buildings sustained heavy damage. The German military command and SS officials utilized these acts of sabotage as a perfect excuse to entirely eliminate the Jewish population in Kiev. The task of executing the operation was assigned to Paul Blobel, commander of the Sonderkommando 4A unit attached to Einsatzgruppen C. On the morning of September 28th, official notices posted all around the city ordered all Jews to gather at a specific intersection the following morning at 8 o'clock. The notices stated that people needed to bring warm clothing, money, and their valuables. This was a bureaucratic deception engineered to make the victims believe the lie that they would be resettled in a new region. On the morning of September 29th, tens of thousands of men, women, and children gathered at the designated location. The crowd was taken on a long march towards the outskirts of the city, along a narrow corridor formed by armed SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliary police. The destination was Babi Yar, a deep ravine located just outside Kiev. As the marching column approached the ravine, the logistical and industrial nature of the operation became apparent. People were taken in groups into areas enclosed by barbed wire. Here, accompanied by violence and shouting, the victims were forced to surrender first their suitcases, then their coats, and finally all their clothing. The civilians, left completely naked, were led down the steep slopes of the ravine in groups of 10. Below, the firing squads, waiting on the sandy ground, made the victims lie face down. To prevent the firing soldiers from becoming exhausted and psychologically breaking down, the execution squads were frequently rotated. While one group of soldiers fired, the other rested in the background and drank alcohol. Machine guns and rifles did not cease for the entire day. The newly arriving groups were forced to lie on top of the people who had just been killed and lay covered in blood. In just 2 days, on September 29th and 30th, exactly 33,771 people were slaughtered in the Babi Yar ravine using this systematic method. The massive mountains of clothing and belongings piled at the edge of the ravine were sorted and sent back to Germany. This massacre proved that death had transformed into a profitable industry belonging to the state. Just a few months after the horror at Babi Yar, a similar industrial slaughter was repeated on the Baltic shores in the Latvian capital of Riga. In November 1941, higher SS and police leader Friedrich Jeckeln received orders to completely liquidate the Riga ghetto. By studying the logistical process at Babi Yar, Jeckeln developed a much more ruthless and mechanical execution method, which he named the Sardinenpackung system. In the Rumbula forest outside Riga, massive and deep pits were dug by Soviet prisoners of war. On November 30th and December 8th, 1941, in the freezing Baltic cold, tens of thousands of people were taken from the ghetto and marched to the Rumbula forest. As they approached the pits, the people were once again stripped of their belongings and clothing. Under Jekyll's system, the victims were led directly down into the pit and ordered to lie face down on top of the dead. A special marksman squad of only 12 men, Jekyll's own staff, walking inside the pit, shot the victims in the back of the neck with a single bullet. The role of everyone at the massacre site was strictly defined. Some marched the people, some collected the clothes, while others simply pulled the trigger. Approximately 25,000 people were killed in this two-day operation that took place in the Rumbula forest. The Babi Yar and Rumbula massacres were etched into history as the operational and logistical apex of open-air executions. The Einsatzgruppen attained the capacity to annihilate tens of thousands of people within a few days. However, these massive open-air slaughters also brought about new pursuits within the SS High Command. In meetings held at headquarters, it was reported that executing such large masses face-to-face psychologically wore down the personnel, and that the gigantic pits eliminated any secrecy. The blood spilled at Rumbula and Babi Yar showed that the death squads had reached the limits of extermination by bullet. This brutality would very soon give way to the gas chambers and extermination camps, which would operate more silently, more mechanically, and further out of sight. Throughout the autumn and winter months of 1941, the gunshots echoing along the edges of massive trenches on the Eastern Front brought about a new problem for the German command echelon. Shooting hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, and children point blank from just a few paces away created a severe psychological toll even on the most hardened and disciplined SS soldiers. Official operation reports sent to Berlin and the RSHA, Reich Security Main Office Headquarters, documented in stark detail the rapidly spreading alcoholism, severe nervous breakdowns, insubordination, and cases of suicide within the death squads. SS leader Heinrich Himmler and the Einsatzgruppen commanders in the field viewed this situation as the spiritual soiling of the soldiers and the collapse of military discipline. It was not the horror experienced by the victims on the killing fields, but solely the psychological integrity of the triggermen that became the primary concern of the Nazi High Command. To solve this problem, to cheapen the cost of murder, and to distance the perpetrators from the direct, bloody physical contact of the massacre, a search for a more silent method began. The solution was the poisonous gas method, which was previously tested with success during the secret T4 euthanasia program that murdered disabled and mentally ill German citizens within the borders of Germany. However, constructing massive, stationary gas chambers under the conditions of a mobile and vast Eastern Front was not found practical given the logistical circumstances of the time. For this reason, a mobile characteristic was bestowed upon the killing machine. Technical departments in Berlin designed special trucks that appeared from the outside as ordinary cargo, furniture, or supply transport vehicles, yet their rear compartments were completely insulated to be airtight. These lethal vehicles, which went down in history as Gaswagen, were placed directly at the disposal and use of the Einsatzgruppen units. This system was the product of cold-blooded and relentless engineering. The exhaust pipe of the truck was connected directly into the sealed rear compartment from beneath the vehicle via a special valve mechanism. Targeted civilians were tightly packed into these dark compartments under the lie that they would be transported to another region or taken to a bathhouse. Heavy steel doors were locked from the outside upon them. The moment the driver started the engine and opened the special valve, the poisonous carbon monoxide gas produced by the engine directly began to fill the compartment. As the truck drove slowly for a 15 or 20-minute journey towards a pre-dug mass grave site, the people inside the compartment suffocated to death in panic and despair. This new invention fully mechanized murder and lifted the psychological burden from the shoulders of the Einsatzgruppen personnel. Soldiers no longer had to look into the eyes of their victims, nor did they have to wait for hours amidst blood and terror at the edge of the trenches. All they had to do was deceive the people, load them into the vehicle, lock the doors, and drive the truck to the burial site. When the truck reached its destination, the doors were opened. Once the toxic gas cloud dispersed, heavy labor such as using hooks to drag the intertwined corpses out of the vehicle and throwing them into the pits was forced upon groups of Jewish prisoners who were kept alive for this exact purpose. The gas vans marked a transitional phase in the massacre process of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. It constituted one of the most concrete and darkest steps in the transformation of violence from a savage street execution into a fully industrialized factory production. In late 1941, the bloody operations of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front reached a terrifying speed. Yet even this pace was not deemed sufficient for the goals of the Nazi High Command. Mobile death squads slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. However, this process became a heavy burden for Germany from both an economic and logistical standpoint. In the midst of a colossal military campaign, the expenditure of millions of bullets solely for civilian executions created ammunition shortages within the army. Meanwhile, the invented gas vans, Gaswagen, constantly broke down on the muddy and ruined eastern roads. Their carrying capacities remained limited, and they failed to provide the expected industrial speed. SS leader Heinrich Himmler and his staff realized that they could not annihilate a massive population totaling 11 million, encompassing the entire Jewish population in Europe, using only firing squads and roaming trucks. It was decided that the extermination process needed to attain a much more institutional, stationary, and fabricated structure. The foundations of this new and final phase were laid on January 20th, 1942, in a villa in Wannsee, a quiet and affluent suburb of Berlin. The conference, convened under the chairmanship of RSHA, Reich Security Main Office, Chief Reinhard Heydrich, was attended by SS officers, as well as undersecretaries of civilian ministries, state railway officials, and economic planners. This meeting determined how death would be integrated into all bureaucratic institutions as a state policy, rather than discussing how a massacre would be committed. With the decisions taken at the meeting table, the plan that went down in history as the final solution gained official status. The entire logistical network, bureaucracy, legal system, and engineering expertise of the state were mobilized for this massive industrial death project. Immediately following the Wannsee Conference, The construction of stationary extermination facilities, which would take over the burden of the mobile death squads on the Eastern Front, was accelerated. In this new phase, launched under the code name Operation Reinhard, massive extermination camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were established in the occupied Polish territories. These camps served a completely different purpose than the concentration or forced labor camps of the previous era. Barracks, production facilities, or areas where prisoners would live for a long time were not built in these locations. These facilities were designed as death factories, where people would be brought in by freight trains departing from all corners of Europe, slaughtered in massive poisonous gas chambers within just a few hours, and their corpses incinerated in special ovens. Along with this transition, the role of the Einsatzgruppen in the field also underwent a change. The task of the mobile death squads gave way to massive railway lines and stationary gas chambers. Soldiers no longer went to the victims to dig deep pits in the forests. The victims were transported directly to the death factories. From this date forward, the Einsatzgruppen units handed over the primary burden of extermination. The squads were shifted more towards tasks of ensuring the security of the logistical network, brutally liquidating the ghettos in the cities to force people onto the death trains, and crushing the increasingly growing partisan resistances behind the front lines. The centralization and industrialization of death proved that the bloody practice initiated by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front had evolved into a much more mechanical, soulless, and irreversible system. Towards the end of 1942, the course of the war on the Eastern Front began to shift against the German army. In the endless forests and freezing swamps of the vast Soviet geography, a powerful partisan resistance sprouted with the participation of leftover soldiers from the Red Army and locals fleeing the brutality of the occupation. Sabotages directed against German supply lines, ammunition trains, bridges, and communication networks behind the front lines grew increasingly violent, while the regular units of the Wehrmacht suffered heavy casualties against the Soviet army at the front. The task of securing the endless terrain in the background largely fell on the shoulders of the SS police units and the Einsatzgruppen. However, instead of engaging in a direct and fair firefight with armed resistors deep in the forests, these dark units adopted a much more ruthless, asymmetrical, and wholesale strategy. When Einsatzgruppen commanders realized it was nearly impossible to seek out and destroy partisans in the harsh terrains where they hid, they developed a new concept of annihilation to sever the lifeblood of the resistance. The fundamental basis of this concept was the total eradication from the map of any civilian village that had the potential to provide food, shelter, intelligence, or human resources to the partisans. These military operations, conducted under the guise of Bandenbekämpfung, bandit and partisan fighting, quickly turned into a systematic punitive expedition directed at the rural civilian population. In the operation orders transmitted from headquarters to the field, the distinction between armed resistors and ordinary civilian villagers was deliberately and completely abolished. According to SS logic, if a village did not inform on partisans, that village was automatically declared an enemy. Deep in Belarus and Ukraine, hundreds of villages and towns fell victim to this merciless tactic. Einsatzgruppen squads and their affiliated local collaborator militias silently surrounded selected villages at dawn. In raids that began during the hours when people were asleep, All villagers were forced out of their homes and crammed tightly into what was usually the largest structure of the village, such as barns, schools, or wooden churches. Heavy doors were locked from the outside, and the buildings were set ablaze by the soldiers. Civilians who tried to break through windows or doors and dash outside to escape the flames and smoke were murdered in cold blood by the crossfire of the encircling firing squads. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, not a single surviving witness was left alive. All livestock, winter supplies, and agricultural produce in the village were confiscated. The remaining homes, wells, and fields were completely burned to ashes. The objective was to leave no vital resource whatsoever where partisans could seek shelter or find nourishment upon their return. In the Belarusian geography alone, over 600 villages were wiped off the map, along with all their inhabitants. These scorched earth tactics, conducted under the guise of anti-partisan warfare, proved that the violence of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front had morphed into an unbounded destruction that no longer targeted only specific ethnic groups, but aimed at the entire civilian population that refused to submit to the German occupation, could not be exploited, or posed a potential logistical threat. In early 1943, following the heavy defeat at Stalingrad, the winds of war turned completely against the German army. The Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, beginning a relentless advance towards the west. As Soviet troops reclaimed the lands occupied by the Germans one by one, a great panic erupted within the Nazi High Command and the SS headquarters. The hundreds of thousands of corpses left behind by the Einsatzgruppen units over 2 years in the endless forests, ravines, and town outskirts of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states remained as a colossal piece of criminal evidence behind the retreating German army. The possibility that the Allies and the Soviets would discover these mass graves and exhibit them to the world prompted the directors of the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin to take immediate action. SS leader Heinrich Himmler ordered that all physical traces of the unprecedented massacres committed be urgently and completely wiped from the face of the earth. To execute this massive cover-up operation, a special and highly classified unit, which went down in history as Action 1005, was established. SS officer Paul Blobel, one of the architects of the Babi Yar massacre, was appointed to head the operation. Blobel and the special units under his command pinpointed one by one on military maps all the coordinates along the Eastern Front, where the Einsatzgruppen had previously carried out executions. However, excavating and emptying these massive pits, which had been opened months or years prior and contained tens of thousands of decomposed corpses, was not a task that German soldiers could or would want to do on their own. To carry out this horrific duty, special work groups named Leichenkommando, consisting of Jewish prisoners gathered from extermination camps and ghettos, were formed. The prisoners, chained by their feet, were brought to these burial sites under the threat of death from heavily armed guards. The field operations of Aktion 1005 set the stage for one of the darkest, heaviest, and most inconceivable logistical processes in human history. Armed with picks and shovels, the inmates reopened the massive pits that had previously been covered with soil through weeks of arduous labor. Thousands of decaying corpses pulled from meters beneath the earth were stacked layer by layer atop enormous wooden pyres constructed using railway tracks and thick tree logs. Each pyre was designed large enough to hold thousands of bodies simultaneously. Wood, combustible materials, and gasoline were poured amidst the piles of corpses, and colossal fires were ignited. These primitive open-air crematoria burned continuously for days on end. The thick, black, and heavy smoke rising into the sky was visible from miles away. Yet, the SS command was not satisfied with merely burning the corpses. They strictly did not want any bones or even a single biological remain to be found. After the giant fires died down, the unburned and remaining large bone fragments were crushed to dust and ground in heavy crushing machines, Knochenmühle, specially designed for this task. The ground bone dust and the remaining ashes were either poured into nearby river waters or scattered into the wind deep in the forest in order to leave no trace. The sites where the mass graves had been were recovered with soil, leveled, planted with trees, and scattered with plant seeds, so as to appear as if nothing had ever happened. When the operation was completed in a region, the entirety of the Jewish prisoners who had carried out this horrifying process and witnessed everything were executed by firing squad at the edge of the pits by the SS guards, so that the secret would vanish with them forever. Aktion 1005 aimed to dry up the sea of blood left behind by the Einsatzgruppen and erase the absolute truth from history. Blobel's squads worked for months, destroying hundreds of thousands of corpses. However, the Red Army's much faster than expected advance cut this dark cover-up effort short before the SS had the opportunity to destroy all the graves. In the spring of 1945, with the fall of Berlin and the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, the war in Europe came to an end. Amidst the rubble of the ruined cities, the Allied forces captured not only war criminals, but also an archive of millions of pages of bureaucracy left behind by the Third Reich. Among these documents, the daily operation records named Ereignismeldungen, which the Einsatzgruppen commanders regularly sent from the Eastern Front to the headquarters in Berlin, were also found. The flawless functioning of the German bureaucracy became the greatest proof of the colossal crimes committed. Because exactly which unit executed how many people, in which town on which date was typewritten and filed in detail down to the bullet count, these reports became the #1 piece of evidence for the international military tribunals established after the war. In 1947, a special military tribunal organized by the United States Army in Nuremberg, which went down in history as the Einsatzgruppen trial, began. This case was recorded as the largest murder trial in world history. Sitting in the defendant's chair were 22 high-ranking SS officers and Einsatzgruppen commanders, many holding doctorate degrees who had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands of people on the Eastern Front just a few years prior. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned ice cold due to the incredible callousness displayed by the defendants. The commander of Einsatzgruppen D. Otto Ohlendorf, in particular, showed no sign of remorse when he took the stand. Ohlendorf described how his unit had executed 90,000 civilians in just 1 year, with a calm, flat, and bureaucratic tone of voice. As if he were presenting an accounting report, the common defense of the accused was that they merely carried out given orders and that their actions were a military necessity. However, the documents presented to the court and the blood-curdling detailed confessions of commanders like Ohlendorf laid bare that this was not a matter of military defense, but entirely an ideological and racial extermination program. In April 1948, the court announced its verdict. 14 of the defendants were sentenced to death, while the rest were condemned to life or long-term imprisonment. Paul Blobel, Otto Ohlendorf, and other chief perpetrators were executed by hanging in Landsberg prison in 1951. This reckoning in Nuremberg became the legal proclamation of how not just 22 officers, but an entire state mechanism transformed into an industry of murder. Although the nameless graves of millions of victims were scattered across the geography, the dark legacy left behind by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front with its documented reality was etched into the records as one of the greatest pages of shame in human history. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.